Hello, I'm Susan Dupree. I've been a member of the bar for over 35 years here in New Hampshire, and I served as managing partner at Devine Willamette. I'm here today interviewing Chuck Douglas, who's a former Superior Court judge, a former Supreme Court judge, and a former congressman. As a former clerk of the New Hampshire Supreme Court myself, when you served in the 70s,
yes.
I'm particularly delighted to be here today interviewing you.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
Before we get into your role as a lawyer and a member of the bar, can I ask you the indelicate question of how old you are?
Yeah, I'm 70 years old, born in 1942 during World War II.
And how long have you practiced here in New Hampshire?
This will be my, I'm trying to think, 35 years now. It's been 45 years, actually, now that I do the math.
And tell us a little bit about your early years, where you grew up, and what effect that might have had on your work habits.
Well, in the 50s, my father bought a gentleman farm in an area outside Philadelphia. And he always wanted a farm, so we had farm animals, horses, a cow, geese, chickens. And that's when I learned responsibility at a very early age. And independence, because there weren't any kids around.
Of course. And when did you move to New Hampshire? He had this farm. What caused you all to move to New Hampshire?
Dad was an executive with an ad agency. He took a job in Concord in 1962, and we moved up here then. So I've been here, now going on more than 50 years.
And where did you wind up in college and law school?
Well, I did a tour of Eastern colleges, Wesleyan, Penn, and then ended up at UNH and graduated in 1965.
And did that have an effect on your future career in either the law or politics?
Very much so, especially the politics part. I ended up being the president of the Young Republicans at UNH in 1964, and that was the year of the Goldwater-Rockefeller split in the Republican Party. I was Youth for Goldwater chairman and a very active conservative Republican in the party.
Was your family involved in politics? Where did you develop this love of politics?
No, I'd say my parents were moderate Republicans, both Republicans, but I just was fascinated with government. I was a government major at UNH, and just the use of power, the abuse of power, the division of power. From when I read Plato's Republic, I actually got fascinated with, how these things work. Plus, it helped that my mind is useless when it comes to math or numbers. So it was easy.
That's true for many of us lawyers, Chuck. So what made you decide to go into the practice of law as opposed to some other area of governance?
Well, it just seemed like if you were going to be interested in government, having a legal background was an easy way to do it. I was fascinated with, the legal system, which is obviously part of our governmental system. So I think it all just kind of fit naturally.
So you decided to go into the practice of law, and where did you go to law school?
Went to BU Law School and had the privilege of having Frank Kennison teach the New Hampshire law course to those of us who were from New Hampshire, because there was no UNH School of Law then. You pretty much went to BC, BU, or any of the other schools, obviously, but New Hampshire was heavily represented in my class.
And Frank Kennison, was he a graduate of BU
Yes.
as well? Because I'm remembering that when I served as a clerk on the Supreme Court, that he always chose, or frequently chose, a BU clerk. So now I'm making that connection.
Yep, and he would come down to Boston in the spring of your senior year in law school once a week and literally teach us what he knew, which was massive, about New Hampshire contract law, tort law, anything that was a little different than the normal 50-state law.
Really interesting. And then he ultimately served for a long time as our Chief Justice at the New Hampshire Supreme Court. So you passed the bar in 1968.
Yes, ma'am.
And then where did you go to work?
Well, I went to the biggest law firm in the state at the time, which was the McLean firm, 16 lawyers. I was the 16th. and I was there for a couple of years. I had worked 2 summers there too as an intern, and then just stayed on and had a great experience there, but only did litigation. I was only really interested in litigation.
Now, as I recall, you also embarked on another career at the same time as practicing law. You got involved with the military. Can you tell us
Yes.
a little bit about that?
Well, I'd been deferred through law school, and the draft was in effect due to the Vietnam War.
Right.
I was on a
Right.
deferment. They finally said, your number is up. You're going to be drafted or join. And I was able to get in the Army Guard in an artillery unit in Manchester, the 197th. And stayed 23 years in the Guard, and still to this day have folks call me for legal work that I was in the Guard with back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Am I remembering right that you were in the JAG Corps?
I went over to JAG after 4 years. I was in artillery, then shifted over to JAG when a slot opened up. That enabled me to get a direct appointment as a captain, because I'd never been to officer school.
Right, right.
Yeah, I had no officer
so were you
training.
practicing law and
Weekend
participating
warrior.
with the military?
Oh yeah. Did my 2 weeks at Fort Drum every summer, and yeah, it was a great experience.
So when you were practicing law back at the McLean firm, tell us a little bit about your early years there. Did you have a mentor there? What kind of work did you do?
I was
What was it like?
what they call the bag man, the assistant on 2 or 3 cases for Arthur Green Sr. and Stanley
Yes.
Brown. Stanley was the best trial lawyer in the state.
He was a legend.
Phenomenal plaintiff's lawyer. And I learned from him that, you know, inspiration or performance in the courtroom is only a minor part of a case. 90% of it is preparation.
Oh, that's
And
really
most lawyers do
interesting.
not do that. Most
would
lawyers
agree.
think, I can just charm them, show up, do my performance, and that's 90%. He said you'll beat them every time if you know that file backwards and forwards, because they're not prepared.
What good advice. And you left McLean ultimately.
Yep,
When
I
did you
did.
leave there?
I left in, I think, January or February of 1970. They were starting, it was just at that time when law firms were starting to break up into departments,
Right.
and they wanted me to do corporate, and I didn't want to do corporate. And I had tried a case against Harry Perkins, who later became a Superior Court judge. His father was a Superior Court judge at the time. And Harry and I ended up going into partnership, and I went from $8,000 a year at McLean to $7,000 a year with Harry. He said, I just can't pay you $8,000. You'll have to take a pay cut. So I did.
Well, I'm sure it was exciting to
Oh, it was.
leave the corporate world and go back into the trial world that you clearly have enjoyed your entire life. Did you get into federal court at all? What kinds of things did you and Harry did you do?
We did a little bit of everything. We did felony work, we did car accidents, we did all kinds of run-of-the-mill stuff, deeds, wills, trusts. It's amazing how much law I knew then. I mean, I could do everything under the sun. I'm still terrified to know there's some titles I did out there. I hope those people die before they sell their house, but it was federal court. We also got assigned, back then they didn't have much of a public defender system.
Right.
And I was assigned, given that our office was a block or 2 away from the federal building, we got assigned criminal cases periodically, and many of them were draft dodger cases.
Interesting. But all this great preparatory work for becoming the trial lawyer you've become over the years.
Well, I still don't have it down, but maybe a few years from now I will. It's a work in progress.
So is there any particular one of your early jury cases that you could talk about?
Well, the first one I had alone was 1970, maybe 71, I'm not sure, but it was over in Keene, and Judge Grant, who was a character, was presiding. And I came to court late one morning, and I noticed his car parked next to the judge's parking space. It was the only one left, so I parked in the judge's parking space, went upstairs. Clerk said, "Judge wants to see you." We went in, and Judge Grant is staring out the window, looking down at my car, and he said, "Douglas?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You're in my parking space." I said, "Well, Your Honor, you're not in it. You're next to it, and it was the last one available." He burst out laughing. It was just his little thing that he enjoyed doing to young lawyers. Of course, I was terrified. Sure, I would be disbarred or jailed. And then as the day went on, he had his dog up on the bench and periodically would disappear. You would not see Judge Grant.
As the trial was going on?
Yeah, the jury trial, and he's just not visible. He's down probably petting the dog. And I stopped, and he said, "I can hear you. I don't have to see you." So we continued on. It was Tut Bell was on the other side, who's a famous lawyer from Keene. And we sometimes didn't see the judge.
How interesting and unsettling in your first jury case. Any other memorable cases you want to talk about from that period?
There was one in federal court, and it was kind of funny because at the time, the early 70s, I was assigned to selective service in the JAG Corps. We were dealing with conscientious objectors, and one of the guys that got arrested is a brilliant kid named Michelangelo Diaz. He came back from Canada. The Ossipee police stopped him and asked for his draft card, which he did not have. So they arrested him for violating the draft law, which apparently local cops could do back then, even though it was a federal law. I never quite explored that, but that's a thought for another day. And I was assigned to defend him and a couple of others, and some of the lawyers, criminal defense bar, went to Judge Bounds and said, "Why do you have Chuck Douglas defending draft dodgers? He's assigned to selective service." And Hugh said, "Poachers make the best game wardens." And,
fascinating.
I had a good trial. Of course, he was found guilty, but it was just an interesting moment in federal practice. I'll never forget Judge Bounds' words, though.
Now, you had kind of a celebrity join your firm a little bit after that.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, Dave Brock had run for the Senate in 1972. I knew him through his friendship with Harry Perkins, and we joined up, and it became Perkins, Douglas, and Brock in probably January of 1973.
And then ultimately you served on the Supreme Court together?
Yes.
As well.
Ironically, later I ended up on the Supreme Court. David came on behind me, and we were colleagues together there as well.
Terrific. So as I'm recalling that period, you were also involved beyond private practice in the political world. So tell us what was going on in your life in politics.
Well, in '72, I was the county chairman for Nixon for President, and was, I think, based on age, then considered a young Republican.
Yes.
So I was selected to be a delegate at the Miami Beach Convention, which was a lot of fun. I also worked for Mel Thompson's campaign. He had run twice before and been defeated in the primary.
Right.
But this time he beat Walter Peterson and became governor after the November '72 election. And he asked me if I'd join the administration as legal counsel. And Mel, being a budget cutter, said, "Oh, and by the way, Marty Gross had been legal counsel and Chuck Leahy legislative counsel under Peterson." He said, "You're going to do both jobs for the same price."
So did you leave the practice of law to do that, or were you able to do both?
Sundays, I was able to meet people at the office on Green Street. It was about 80-hour weeks all the time. Governor would call me at 7 in the morning, say, I'm here, I need to find such and such, and of course I'm just getting up trying to get there by 8. Mel's already there by 7. It was a very fascinating experience. It was a lot of fun.
It must have been exciting. And that was an exciting time nationally as
yes,
well.
With Watergate going on.
And as I'm recalling, during that period, Ronald Reagan was sort of beginning to make an entry onto the national stage.
Yes.
And given our country's fascination with him, did you ever have a meaningful opportunity to meet him?
Yes, I was fortunate enough in, I'm going to say, the summer of '74, doing this by my best memory. Peter Thompson, who was the governor's son, and Ed Meese, who was then Attorney General,
right,
and Governor Reagan. Mel had met the governor at governor's conferences, liked him. Reagan was in Boston speaking, and he came up on a secret visit to the Highway Hotel, there where Hannaford's and Staples are today on Fort Eddy Road, but the old Highway Hotel, and there were just 5 or 6 of us who met and talked about whether we would support Ronald Reagan for president if he ran, if the Nixon thing collapsed, which it started to look like that was well underway.
Right. Did you have a sense at the time of how momentous that was?
I knew he was going to be a powerful candidate. He was a terrific personality, easy to meet, talk with, charming, but it was a lot of fun to be there at the very beginning before there was any announcement. I think he wanted to be 100% sure that the Thompson wing of the party would swing behind him, and he didn't want to have a divisive situation.
And so can you reveal to us what the outcome of the meeting was, or is that still top secret?
No. Mel made it very clear that if this thing were going to be a primary, he would be supporting Ronald Reagan.
And Mel was quite conservative.
Oh, very conservative, very controversial.
Right.
You know, we were in battles all over the State House. Warren Rudman was Attorney General, and Warren and I had lunch early in the beginning of this thing because I said we need to work on how we're going to work with these state agencies. And he said, well, here's the deal. I don't like your governor. I don't want to give him any legal advice, and he won't listen anyway. But don't you, Chuck, tell state agencies what to do. I said, deal. So, of course, what that meant is every time Meldrum sued someone or wanted to sue or got sued, I ended up having to represent him because the AG's office said, you want him, you got him. And I had many occasions to go to court on behalf of the governor.
And that was quite exceptional.
Oh, it was.
Not only in the run-up to that period, but since.
Yep.
I don't think we've ever really seen anything quite like that. Today we might see the Attorney General sort of pushed out, perhaps, of the position.
But
and there would be a little quiet exit.
Well, it ended up, Mel and Rudman ended up good friends in the end. But at the beginning, it was very contentious because Rudman had been very, very close to Governor Peterson, and that's understandable.
Sure.
And he was not as conservative as Mel Thompson. So it was, and Mel's style was very different than Walter's, so there were multiple reasons, but it worked.
But as a young man, it must have been fascinating to not only be a bystander seeing this, but then to participate in it and to represent the governor in the way that you did, which was quite unusual.
I think if I hadn't had my background in young Republicans, government classes at UNH. I worked in the legislature in 1965 full-time. That gave me a grounding about how the House and Senate worked. For my age, being in the 20s, I wouldn't have been able to do it. Plus, I knew Mel. I had worked with him, and I could instinctively know where he would go on certain legislation. And so we had a good working relationship.
It was a great partnership.
Yeah.
And I think that one sees these in history, and it's to some degree a right place, right time. But I think there's also some kind of magnetic attraction between people who have a similar understanding and can see that this relationship is going to be of benefit to both of them.
We got along well, but there were times when he drove me absolutely nuts. And I knew how to get his attention when I had to penetrate his force field. And it was to use profanity, because he hated that. And when I would, he would say, Chuck, 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 no, 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 okay, okay, okay. And I'd say, well, can we talk? And then I had gotten his attention. And I won't tell you the Anglo-Saxon words I used, but they were attention getters when I needed to dial him in.
So tell me, does something stand out as a major issue when you were serving with him?
Well, one that affected the law was the tort reform efforts in the 70s had swept over Massachusetts, and they had adopted no-fault auto insurance, which meant you didn't make a claim against the other driver. Your carrier paid you if you were injured in a car crash, I think up to a certain amount. And about every 10, 15 years, tort reform comes to New Hampshire. It was in the 70s. I was there in '86 when we had to fight it. It was there a few years ago. Every time the market goes south, the insurance companies blame the trial lawyers.
Of course.
It's like totally predictable. It's like phases of the moon. They got tort reform in the form of no-fault auto insurance passed. Dave Nixon, who's a trial lawyer of great reputation, was president of the Senate, and he unfortunately couldn't kill it in the Senate. But interestingly enough, I convinced the governor to veto it, and that we did not have a tort reform crisis in New Hampshire, and he vetoed the bill, and it was sustained. So since 1974, we have not had no-fault auto insurance in New Hampshire.
Correct. Now, you served with the governor for several years, and oftentimes when people serve the governor, something else happens in their life. They get some kind of an appointment, and you did.
Absolutely.
Tell us about that.
Watergate was totally turning me off to politics at the time. I was very upset with the lying, the cover-up, the whole situation. It's not what I wanted to be involved in government or politics. And luckily, and I had gone back to practice in July, so it was 3-4 months back in Green Street in my law office. And the governor called up and said there's a 13th Superior Court judge. The population of New Hampshire was rigged such that every 60,000 people you got another Superior Court judge. Might have been 70,000, but whatever that trigger had occurred had happened. And of course, he asked me if I wanted to do it. And I thought about it because I thought, geez, I've never wanted to be a judge.
And you were very young.
Yeah, I was 32.
So you must have been one of the youngest Superior Court judges in our history.
Well, youngest probably in the 20th century. Charles Doe was in his 20s when he was appointed a judge, so he was the youngest, I think, ever in New Hampshire. But I thought about it and then decided, okay, it's a totally different direction, but I would take it. And back then, obviously, there was no screening commission. The governor knew me. It was, you know, the way things were done.
So this was a big change in your
Big
life.
change,
How was
yeah.
day number one on the job of the Superior Court?
Well, I thought I was going to get shot on day one because I was in Manchester in the courthouse. That's where all of us were trained then. They'd start you with Carl Randall in Manchester, who had been clerk for
Right,
years.
I remember him.
And he later became a Superior Court
Yes.
judge. I went through the door, headed down the hall. I had a borrowed robe under my arm, and I heard a voice saying, "Stop, stop, where are you going?" And I stopped and I turned around. It was a bailiff said, "You can't go down there." I said, "I'm sorry, I was told I had to go to Chambers 4. "Well, who are you?" I said, "Well, I'm Judge Douglas. I'm the new judge." Oh, yes, let me take you, Your Honor." So that was my kind of heart-stopping moment, and it went downhill from there. No, it was fine.
Now, I'm recalling at the time that the Superior Court was on a kind of a circuit basis.
Yes.
Tell us about that. Did you ride circuit, and what exactly did that mean? I never really understood that, I think, as a young lawyer.
Well, it goes back to the 1800s, when literally you would ride a circuit on a horse. A judge would go for a term of court in Keene, stay at a hotel, they'd ride up to Haverhill, to Grafton County. There were only 4 or 5 Superior Court judges in the 1800s, and they would ride from, 2 months here, a
Right.
month there. That tradition continued when I went on in '74, and I served in 7 counties, some only for a month, others for
Right.
a longer period of time. But very rarely were you stationed at a county. That came later, partly due to the fact
Interesting.
that there were more judges. They didn't all have to move, and they were starting to get appointed more regionally. And they were it was easier for file continuity to have
Right.
someone stay on a case. But back then, I had 2+ years on Superior Court, just a tad over 2 years, but I had the privilege of sitting in 7 different counties.
How interesting. So jury trials back then, I would imagine, are a
Yes.
little different than they are today, and the jurors probably look different and serve differently. What can you tell us about that time?
They used to be picked by the selectmen. The panel was chosen by the selectmen, and what they would do is look for people they felt had the time and the education and the ability to serve as jurors. So they were older. The men came wearing ties, jackets. They were dressed. There were fewer women, obviously, because most selectmen were men, and they were
Right.
picking, oh, well, he's on the planning board and this guy's on the zoning board. They'd make a good juror. Or he's retired, so he can afford to do it. And they were called key man juries. That was challenged later in court, and the system had to go to a random pick.
Right.
But everyone smoked then. I smoked.
Oh my gosh.
And they had ashtrays in the jury room. I had ashtrays in chambers. And I would tell the jury, if I knew there was something coming, this is a 2-cigarette break. So when you go out, this is going to be a little longer than a 1-cigarette break.
Now, was the quality of their judgment different then than today? Because it's a different cast of characters that we have on
Very
juries
different.
today.
Yeah. I don't know that the results were appreciably different. I
Good.
frankly don't
Good.
think they were.
Okay.
It's just that you didn't have 23-year-olds with a T-shirt saying, screw the system or some stupid thing. You didn't have that type of juror. But today we get a good cross-section.
And people still take this job as a juror seriously.
They may not take it seriously on day one, but I noticed a case I tried a year ago this month. The jurors dressed better as we got to Wednesday. I think they realized this had consequence.
Yes.
It was a suit against state police for a trooper who'd been had some problems at the state police headquarters, but they realized this is important. And I saw them dress better. It was interesting than on the first day. So it was just something they realized this stuff does matter. And I strongly believe in juries. They do a better job than judges on certain cases.
Right.
Because they're not, they don't come assuming the system is always going to be right.
Right.
There's some skepticism of government there that judges probably get used to a different role.
So, sitting as a young judge, tell us about any memorable jury trials or trials that you got to oversee.
Well, I'm just trying to think of one that nothing, frankly, comes to mind except a case involving a young man in Rockingham County, Leo Feely. I still remember his name. Whitey Frazier, who's now retired as a district court judge. Whitey was a phenomenal defense lawyer. And Leo had pled guilty since age 8 to various offenses. His entire life had been spent in and out of jail, prison, but he'd never had a trial. And Sheriff Sampson came to me and said, I'm going to have to shackle this guy and gag him because he's so violent and he's so dangerous. And I talked to Whitey and the prosecutor and I said, what do you think? And Whitey said, you know, why don't you just talk to him? He's never been through a trial. So they bring Leo in against the sheriff's wishes, unshackled, unhandcuffed, sits down in chambers with the prosecutor, me, Whitey Frazier, and I asked him if he wanted a cigarette, which he did. So we all had, well, those of us that smoked had cigarettes, and we chatted. And when we were done, Leo said, you know, it looks like you would be fair. If you're going to be fair, I will behave. I said, well, that's a good deal. And we shook on it and never had a problem. He was a perfect gentleman. He charmed the jury, and he got a lesser included. It was like aggravated assault instead of attempted murder because he was so well behaved, and he frankly had a story to tell. He had some justification, but Whitey did a phenomenal job. He was a
legend also.
Yeah. So, but that was one I'll never forget.
Now, today we know that judges have a great deal of security, and because of various threats that they have made against them. Did you ever feel threatened as a judge when you were on the Superior Court?
Only once, and I don't know that I really felt threatened, but the bailiffs and the sheriffs thought I was. There had been a strike at the dog track in Seabrook.
Yes.
And there were fires for the handling areas, and some of the kennels were burned. It was a mob takeover of a union. It was up and down the East Coast, from Flagler in Florida all the way to New Hampshire. And the state was losing revenue every day the track was closed, so they brought contempt against this group. And I was the only judge on April vacation. I was the newest, so I had Rockingham County, and all the cases flowed there for that week.
Right.
But I got that one, and I had to do a crash course with a law clerk on contempt of court, civil versus criminal, direct versus indirect, because I had never dealt with that. But one night, we had kept trying to serve the head of the union, and he was dodging the subpoena. And one of the bailiffs told me he's going to be on Channel 9 tonight in Manchester. He's coming up from Revere.
Right.
I said, serve him. Well, I didn't know, but I'm watching the 6 o'clock news. Fred Coker is interviewing the guy, and suddenly they turn, and a sheriff walks up to him and says, "You've been served."
Oh,
hands him the subpoena live on air. Fred's kind of like this, you know. Channel 9 at the time was
got a
very,
great story.
very primitive, but they didn't know what to do. And then the guy looked into the camera and he said, "Good luck to that judge." So that's when they said, "We're going to give you round-the-clock police presence at your house, because we don't know exactly what that means, but it's probably not good." And I said, "No, that's fine."
It's good they were on top
Yeah,
of that,
yeah.
though. So you spent how many years on the Superior Court?
Two plus, a little over 2.
So really not very long.
Not very long at all. And then the phone rang, and it was Bob Griffith had retired at age 70. His son John and I had practiced together at the McLean firm.
Right.
And John, anyway, is a good friend, and his dad had retired. So the governor called up and said, "You know, I now have a slot on the Supreme Court, and is that something you'd like to do?" And I really didn't want to do it because I really enjoyed being a trial judge.
Action
I was
of it.
just getting into it, and had, you know, managed to get up and off the bench without catching the robe on my foot and falling. I mean, I had done a lot of really good things. But that offer may not come by again. So I said I would be honored, but I said, "Can I think about it a couple of days?" So, and then I got moved up January 1 of 77.
So you replaced Judge Griffith.
Bob Griffith, yep.
That was the year I was clerking, so it was fascinating to have this young judge, because all the other judges
Oh,
were
you had
considerably
been there
older.
when Bob was still there, that's
I
right.
did. So I was there for his last 4 months. Then you
Okay.
arrived, which caused quite a commotion with everybody. But first, let me ask: in replacing Judge Griffith, did he have any special requests of you? Do judges make special requests
did.
of their succeeding
He did.
folks?
Yeah, it was interesting. He did. I don't think I did. I know I did not when I left, but Bob said to me, "Chuck, in the office, the little office, the first one on the left, which is the junior judge, there's a portrait in there of a man named, I think his name is Lyman Walker." And he said, "You know, everyone has their good times and their bad times." And he said, "Lyman was impeached for intemperance. And when he was painted, he had green glasses to cover his red, bloodshot eyes. But he said he must have done something good in his life. And I would appreciate it if you could keep his portrait up, because I just think somebody needs to, you know, give him a shot at staying where he is in the building." And I said I'd be honored to. And so my entire time I had these green glasses on a 1840 attorney general who'd been impeached for intemperance. I think he dodged it in the Senate, so he was never removed from office. But it was just our little fun thing. And when I'd see Bob, he'd say, "You still have Lyman?" I said, "Oh yeah, he's still up, don't worry." He's still up, but he's down the hall now, because I guess people have forgotten the tradition.
But you were his protectorate.
But I protected him as long as I could.
So tell us a little bit about that period on the Supreme Court, who the Chief Justice was, and you know what I'm going to say you walked into.
Well, it was a court of, I was in my 30s, all of them were in their 60s.
Right.
Every one of them was in their 60s and basically late 60s. Many of them had done this for years and years, 25, 30 years. It's an involuntary law firm in the sense that you don't get to pick your partners.
Very interesting.
And they reminded me of that. They didn't pick me,
Oh.
and I did not pick them. Judge Kennison stressed dissent. He said we try not to dissent here. And he said the test you should use is, are you so sure that these other 4 lawyers are wrong and you're right. And if you're that sure that they've all got it wrong, dissent. But he said if it's a hold your nose thing and you can live with it, do it. And that was good advice, because I probably was more prone to wanting to do it my way than, they were. But we got along fine. I served under 4 chief judges. I had Kennison, and then I had Lamprin, and we had Grimes, and then John King. So I had the privilege of, working with in 8.5 years, a great variety of people. And I enjoyed all of them and learned a lot from each one of them. But the court was changing and ready for some change when I got there.
My memory is that Judge Souter might have been around for part of your time on the
83 to
Supreme Court.
85, but the first 5 years I was on, or 6 years, was the time when the court kind of changed. Judge Bois and Judge Grimes and I had very strong views on property rights. We were not going to bless everything a government did or a zoning board did. We were more skeptical of government. We, I think, just wanted a little more accountability in certain areas than the older court. So there were some changes in case law.
I think there were at the time. The clerks used to say there was a new majority that was formed with you and Judge Grimes and Judge Bois, that a shift that started taking place when Judge Bois came on the bench was completed when you came on. And then it really did become a different era. Sort of the Kennison era as we knew it at the time was coming to a close, and things were shifting with the times.
Yeah, one of the major shifts was of great import to us was Conference Day, because Morris Bois and I both smoked cigarettes and Frank Kennison smoked cigars. And that was very important if we're going to spend all day. But it was put to a vote, we will no longer smoke during conference.
Oh.
And Bois, Kennison, and I won 3-2, killing that motion. But after Frank retired a year later, the non-smokers won 3-2.
They prevailed.
And I, shortly afterwards, had to learn how to quit smoking.
Well, that was probably a
But that's a very momentous event, in New Hampshire history.
Yes. So did you have any notion at the time that you served with Judge Souter on the court that he might actually climb all the way up to the perch he ultimately assumed?
I figured, I thought, frankly, he'd probably just stay there. I hadn't thought of his moving to the First Circuit and then on to the Supreme Court, but he clearly had the temperament and the inclination to serve as an appellate judge, and with distinction. So I wasn't surprised. And in fact, I was in Congress when his confirmation hearing came up, and I got to testify on his behalf. So it was kind of ironic.
So tell us a little bit about what oral argument was like at the time, and some of the more memorable cases. I remember it that way myself.
Horrible. It was 40 minutes aside.
Yes.
And
the cases weren't that momentous, as I recall it.
If you do 40 minutes aside in a boundary line dispute or a contract case, I mean, I had the no-dose box right on the bench, and at 10 minutes, I'm ready to go to sleep or shoot myself. So we, after Frank Kennison retired, we quickly changed it to 20 minutes aside. Now it's down to 15. But yeah, it's just too long.
Yes.
I mean, some cases, and the court's good, if you need more time, you'll get it.
Right.
But if you give a lawyer an hour, they'll take an hour. If you give them 15 minutes, they'll do it in 15 minutes. It's just human nature.
So, was there some most memorable opinion that you had from the time?
Two that come to mind, Susan, is, or rather are, the Cloutier versus A&P. The law on wrongful discharge of employment was evolving. The court had decided the B.B. Rubber case before my time. They were moving towards a way for an employee who was wrongfully terminated in bad faith for doing something public policy approves of to get protection. And the one thing I will say that I most remember both at BU and on the court, Frank Kinnison's view of tort law is it's a flowing river. It's not a stagnant pool. And as society changes, tort law, which is man-made, judge-made law, it's not statutory, it's judge-made, needs to change with the times. And that was one I was very pleased we had a dissent. I think Judge Bois dissented, but we got a majority for that case. And then the other one was a time back then when federalism and the U.S. Supreme Court opinions were being copycatted across the country. State Supreme Courts weren't thinking on their own, whether it was Mapp versus Ohio, Miranda versus Arizona, they just take it as holy writ, even though it was not under their constitution. And we wanted to have our own analysis and not just copycat all the federal decisions, because we were thinking, you know, if we're an independent state Supreme Court with our own constitution that's actually older than the federal constitution, we're not, you know, a bureau of the federal government. And so State versus Ball was born in that era and is still alive and well today. It's literally the most cited opinion the court has had, because virtually every case involving the state constitution involves the recitation of the formula from State versus Ball.
I remember that time. I remember that New Hampshire became sort of a standout in terms of its jurisprudence and was actually looked to, which was, I think, given our political history, a fitting role for our court. Now, in a kind of unusual move, you ended up leaving the court.
Yes.
When did you leave, and how long had you served, and why did you leave?
Well, after 8 years, I was at the point where I had to think long and hard, am I going to stay and do this the rest of my life?
And
I was 42.
Very young.
So I'm thinking, I think I was 42. It was somewhere in there. Yeah, probably 42. And I was trying to decide what was best for a lot of reasons. It was not holding my interest as much. I felt I'd lost my First Amendment rights. I missed the trial arena. And frankly, I also had 2 boys to educate, and on $54,000 a year to do St. Paul's and a good private college was not going to work. So I came to the decision I was going to leave and just go back into practice. And I didn't get a life sentence. I loved my time.
Yes.
I don't regret it, but I was ready to do something else. And so I resigned effective in August of 1985.
And that was a very unusual move at the time. I remember that. And
yep, it's not usual, but I also was much younger too.
You were.
Had I been appointed in my 50s, I'm sure I wouldn't have done that, but it was just, for me, the right thing to do at the time.
And I'm sure it was an advantage to your clients over the years, having seen both sides of the bench.
It gives you a different perspective. It does. It does.
So tell us what happened then.
Well, I went into practice in Concord with some guys I knew from BU Law School, Graham McSwiney, Carol Jones, and we did plaintiff's work. We did all kinds of litigation. And I got my freedom back to, write op-eds for the newspaper and chime in on campaigns and so forth. So it was fun.
And you did. You entered politics
I did,
again. And tell
yeah.
us what
Well,
happened after a couple of years.
Judd Gregg had the 2nd District congressional seat and decided he wanted to run for governor. So Judd announced he was not going to run again in '88. And I threw my hat in the ring in May, June of that year.
Yes.
And I know you and Stephen were helpful to me, and I won the primary and then won the election. So off to Congress in January of '89.
That was a very exciting period.
Yes.
It was what I think of as being the Gingrich era.
Yeah.
Many of us Republicans were very taken by him. So tell us what it was like to serve during that time.
Well, it was exciting. Newt was a backbencher. He had no title. He had great energy and enthusiasm. The Republicans were a permanent minority, and everyone figured we would be that way forever. Newt said, no, we can change this. So I had the privilege of being the freshman whip when he was running for whip, because Dick Cheney had gone over to the White House.
Right.
And he had been the Republican whip from Wyoming in the House. And Newt got 17 of the 18 freshmen. I lost one, Jimmy Walsh from upstate New York, because he'd promised his father something. And then Newt won by one vote, 88 to 87, over the Republican establishment candidate from Illinois, and became whip, and then, of course, later speaker after I was gone.
Right. Well, I'm just struck by the fact that revolution seems to follow you. Things were shaken up on the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Things were shaking up in the governor's office. Things were shaken up in Congress when you were there. You're always at the scene of the crime, scene of the accident.
We were in Egypt a month before Mubarak fell, so there you have it.
That's right, I remember that.
Probably shouldn't have gone to Egypt. He'd still be in power, but I don't know what it is.
Now, did you get to serve on any, I know it was a brief stint in Congress,
Yep.
but did you get to serve on any exciting committees, any major committees?
The major one was Judiciary, which is always a major committee because all the hot button issues, guns, abortion, death penalty, everything goes to Judiciary. So we, had our usual battles over fairly predictable issues, but we also had 2 impeachments of federal judges, and I had never seen that process from the legislative branch. And then I was also on government operations, which is now called government oversight, but it's the same committee, and got fascinated with the situation in Central America. We had some oversight over funding of the various conflicts in Central America that had started in the 80s.
And tell us a little bit about those conflicts. And did you get to, I know congressmen and senators often get to go to various hot spots in the world. Did you actually get to go to observe some of this?
I did. I never went to Paris for the air show or London or anything. I went to Tegucigalpa. I went to Panama City. I went to the Contra camps on the Nicaraguan border.
Right, that was a big issue at the time.
And then I got to be an election observer in El Salvador. So in March of '89, and we helicoptered around various polling places to monitor whether it was a violent election or not. In fact, one town we went to, 50 people had been shot the week before, and they were concerned about our safety, but it had calmed down. There were soldiers everywhere, but we observed, and the people were lined up and they wanted to vote, and that was amazing under those circumstances. Incredible. And we have people who don't get off their butt and vote here, but there they were literally risking their life to stand in a line in the hot sun just for the privilege of voting. So I thought it was a great experience.
Well, with everything that was going on in the federal government at the time, this seat became a very hotly contested seat. And you lost your second election.
I did. I got knocked off.
As often happens, they always go after the first termers because that's the easiest time to knock somebody
Right.
off.
If you're going to get them early. Yeah.
So then, what turn did your life take then?
Back to private practice, 1991, and I've been at it ever since. Do employment law for plaintiffs, personal injury, a lot of suits against the government, police violence, prison violence, wrongful termination cases. It's a good, exciting area of helping people and leveling the playing field for folks who need it.
I would just like to chime in on that because oftentimes when I'll read that you've taken on a case, what jumps to mind for me is how lucky they are to have Chuck Douglas, because he takes on cases that nobody else would take on, and then you succeed with them, which never stops shocking many people out there in the legal industry, and you do it over and over again and successfully. So tell us the name of your firm.
Okay, it's Douglas, Leonard, and Garvey.
And on your reentry, and you've been at this for, another 20 plus years.
I guess, yeah.
What observation do you have about the current bar and its collegiality and how it operates as opposed to when you started as a younger guy?
It's just so much bigger, there's so many folks, and the problem is in getting to know people, we're more segmented now. Right. If someone just does corporate or they just do marital, I may not run into them. I mean, I may meet them once at some function or maybe at a courthouse, but you don't do everything. We're all very specialized, and that is good for our clients because they're getting better, hopefully better legal work, but at the same time, you don't have the interplay with a broader piece of the bar than you did maybe 30, 40 years ago.
Right. And it strikes me a little bit as it's easier to not be as collegial when you don't know someone as well.
That's true. That's true. And sometimes I think television affects younger people and lawyers' concept of what they're supposed to do in a courtroom or in interpersonal relationships. The internet makes it very easy to send an outrageous email.
True.
Whereas if you had to dictate a letter, proofread it, look at it, by 4 o'clock the venom may be gone. But if it's just send, I find lawyers say stupid things that they shouldn't, and it's mainly in emails, not in a letter.
I think that's a really true observation. And it's the old take 10 deep breaths and see if you still feel that way.
No,
and we
right.
don't, now our system isn't one where you have time to take those breaths. It's a lot more impulsive.
I agree.
So you're 70.
Yes.
And what you're thinking about you and the law in the future?
Well, I'm going to keep practicing for several more years. I have a place in Florida, so we get away several weeks a year there. I'm going to do retirement on the installment plan. I can't just quit because my golf game will never get better, and I don't want to just do that all the time. I like people, and I like being able to have a challenge, and if I don't have that, I just retirement would be boring to me.
Well, and you care about their problems. I guess that would be my observation. Given everything that you've seen in your life and the way the practice of law has trended, would you recommend to young people that they go into the practice of law today?
I think it depends on the person and what they think they're going to do in the law. If your thought is it's going to be glamorous, exciting, you're going to have multi-million-dollar cases, then you probably aren't thinking straight. You're going to have to be willing to do what Stanley Brown taught me. Know that file, put the time in. It takes its toll on families to be really good as a lawyer, especially a trial lawyer. 5 o'clock doesn't mean anything. 10 o'clock is the time you get home if you're in a trial.
Right.
And I don't know that everyone knows what it means. I think you have to kind of know yourself and what works for you, what kind of law you might want to do. But with the debt load today, it's a tough decision for young folks.
So we're coming to a close, and there are a couple of final questions I'd like to ask.
All right.
One is what your observation is of the role of the judge has made on law in our society.
The judiciary is the great balance wheel between the other two branches. Let's face it, the legislative and the executive are elected. Majority rules, but we have a Constitution and a Bill of Rights that protects minority rights. And the only way that happens often is through a free press and an independent judiciary. So if that judiciary is not there to check what the majority, governor, president, legislature, Congress, whatever, it doesn't matter what level, it's the same principle, which is the brilliance of the founders, we have a problem. And so a strong independent judiciary is essential for our democracy, and a strong and vibrant jury system of voters who get a chance to say to their government, you did wrong, or you did right. So I think that's important. Due process is the judiciary's baby, and essentially they decide what process is due in certain situations. And I would just say, if you were blindfolded, put on a plane, and flown around the world and taken off, and you had one question to ask as you stand there with your hood and your blindfold, you don't know where you are, there's only one question you need to ask. If I'm accused of a crime, do I have to prove I'm innocent, or do you have to prove I'm guilty? And the answer to that will tell you where you are. Are you in England, Australia, the United States, or are you in Iran, China, etc.? And that, to me, is the key, is the citizens' rights protected by a judicial system.
Well, that's a very profound comment, especially in the particular environment we find ourselves in today. So thank you for that, and thank you for doing this interview.
Well, thank you, Susan.
I
You
really
did a great,
appreciate it. I've enjoyed talking with you.
You did a great job. Thanks as
always.
always.
Thanks so much.
Okay.